Hi everyone, you get 10 points if you can guess which university I go to, because I've not made it obvious at all. So this is basically a whistle-stop tour to present some of the kinds of current thinking into the surrounding conversations on my thesis, where I'm focusing on the idea of sexual play in pornographic video games. And what I hope to suggest with this is that we can kind of view pornographic or adult video games as occupying a kind of queer space, one that is to do with possibilities and rearticulation, and that the inclusion of sexual elements of video games kind of disrupts different kinds of cultural norms that we may see as it intervenes and emerges in spaces that it wasn't supposed to exist. And so I'll overview some of the examples that we do kind of see. There are a few omittances and gaps due to time, and that they'd warrant their own conversation, but hopefully it should provoke some conversations anyway. So, just a disclaimer, obviously I research and talk about pornography and sex and games. So some are positive, light and fun. Some are quite harmful and violent and exploitive. But I have blurred any not safe for work content for the purposes of this presentation. And if you know of your own examples of adult or sexual games, video games, please do put them in the chat. I would love to know what they are. So the first thing it's important to do is define what I mean by queerness in this presentation. Obviously, there's various ways to take queerness, but I'm taking it for this as this space that features many different kinds of territories of possibility, allowing behaviours and existences outside of normative boundaries. So in essence, we're kind of playing against the grain, against normative conventions and structures, and we're doing something that in that regard is quite culturally transgressive, as we're behaving and interacting in ways that aren't necessarily meeting the conventions or conforming to particular standards that we see in games or the wider games culture as a whole. The next thing I obviously need to define is what I mean by pornographic or adult video games. That in itself is quite a broad term, given the range in content. For me, I define it as video games that are targeted more towards adult audiences, and they feature explicit sexual material or allowing some kind of sexual satisfaction that then becomes tied to the design or experiences of them. And this can be kind of embodied in various different ways, ranging from the mechanics of a game through to a narrative, the visual spectacles that you see, or the emergent interactions that exist between players. And I refer to them specifically as pornographic and not just adult, because I think that elements such as the visual spectacle do borrow from pornographic cultures as a whole. As Romero and Hart point out, that sex in game can be quite explicit or implicit, hidden or very much obvious in front of you, and can also be found from flirtation to quests or missions, and also be offered as a reward for players for achieving certain objectives. And this goes to the extreme of having sexual simulators that are designed to, in essence, bring the player to a sense of orgasm or climax. And that also starts to interrogate the kinds of purpose of having sexual content in games and what kind of intention there is for that presence. So I've put some examples here. This isn't a definitive list, it goes beyond this, but this is just some of the range of inclusion or presence of sex that you can find. So you can most definitely see aspects such as nudity and sexual scenes occurring in games. The example I've given here is one of my favorites, which is Coming Out on Top, a visual novel that features shots of characters getting up to all kinds of explicit mischief when you pick their pathway if you want to romance them. You have virtual relationships and marriages that can occur with in-game characters or other players, commonly seen in quite a lot of online simulation or mass multiplayer online role-playing games. We see it in the representation or aesthetics of video game characters, for example, such as gaming's representative buff daddy Kratos. Sexual practices can also be embodied in the ludic design of games, with the case here of Hurt Me Plenty that presents the consent agreement and aftercare of BDSM and kink cultures. And this goes again through to the extreme of explicit sexual online simulators, where you can meet other players and engage in explicit sexual activity to build a sense of sexual satisfaction, and towards its purpose, such as using the idea of sex to actually inform and educate different types of audiences on sexual practices. So we're kind of dealing with this very broad range of ambiguous field here, where thinking of the embodiment of sex could be seen as pornographic in a variety of different ways. And even more so, you can employ it using the joystick and its phallic imagery, or in Atari's case, use a woman's breasts to make an entire arcade machine because they deemed that as appropriate for some reason. So, safe to say, we have a lot going on here, but there's also a lot of questionable behavior going on here as well. And so we come to this sort of relationship between sex and games through this idea of queerness. So, as I said, I sort of defined it as being this territory of possibility that's deviant against different kinds of norms. And we can kind of see some similar sort of perspectives between them. So, Iacenta here points out that sex is quite mysterious, transgressive, and unpredictable. We can never really know from the outset what will occur, in the same way that games themselves can also be a site for experimentation, and that they're also possibility spaces that feature their own rule systems. Now, both sex and games do feature their own set of conventions and structures that would basically facilitate the play, but not necessarily enforce types of play. As Shaw and Ruberg point out, this is a contradiction, that they are both spaces of freedom and possibility, whilst also containing ideas of normative and oppressive structures. And so, thinking about playing with this interaction of sex and games, we're kind of traversing through this multidimensional space that's quite fluid. And by not conforming, we're in essence embodying this queer sense. We're going against the norm. We're changing the rules. We're reappropriating the space to suit what it is we desire through play. So there's a lot to say about queer behaviour and power structures with regards to sex and games. And this got me thinking about the ideas of power control, resistance, and deviance to the kinds of normalities and cultural norms into three different themes that I feel like are embodied in pornographic video games. And one of them is sex and resistance. Now, Romero documents that the sex has had quite a conflicting relationship with video games. And a lot of that is provoked by this traditional idea that games are just entertainment for children. And that's something you will actually see quite hinted at frequently in this presentation, that games are just simply entertainment for children, whereas, as hopefully this presentation shows, that the inclusion of sexual elements shows that games go just beyond that. And to Kaiser, sex has been folded into games from the get-go. So what we can allude from this is that sex in games, and especially the pornographic video game, is something of a re-emergent entity. It's resisting different kinds of control and change, whether that's politically, socially, or technologically. Regardless of these changes in games culture and games economy, sexuality still seems to exist and bring about some sort of sexual experience, no matter the kinds of rules that surround it. Some good and some bad, as you will soon see. So as you can see, we've gone from the arcade days here with the sort of implicit imagery. We also have this in the shift from early user networks or your multi-user dungeons through to online social worlds, where dungeons like Lambda Mu and Shades, where sex occur through interactions and players can build relationships and conduct sexual activity through typing messages to each other. And so was reliant on these internal subjective imaginations. And this is kind of queer because the game did not predict that this would actually occur. They weren't designed for that kind of interaction, and yet players took it upon themselves to actually embody that. And then you come to the more 3D based sexual simulators like 3D Gay Villa and Sociolatron, which use 3D models to actually bring about that visual spectacle. And so they also become space for queer communities themselves to interact sexually in games that we may not have been necessarily able to do so before. So we can see this idea of emergent and sexual relations and practices changing and being reappropriated to suit. Please note the next slide does contain games that do talk about sexual violence, so just as a word of warning, they have been blurred as well. You unfortunately do get the dark side of this. If you want to take the MUDs and online social worlds as a bit more positive in emergence, this is the not positive emergence. These two, Custer's Revenge and Rayplay, are examples in which deviant acts of reality become a form of entertainment oddity. As Mills points out, the inclusion of sex started to expose younger audiences to different kinds of harmful material. And both of these games here utilize very much sexual violence as part of their entertainment. And that's something that is, in essence, not only deviant in reality, but it's also deviant and transgressive in a lot of game spaces as well. So that caused a lot of, understandably, controversy, and there were wider claims for it to be changed, more regulations, and so on and so forth. So leading on to less harmful content, more slightly uplifting discussions, we come to companies that are saying that they are family friendly. So Microsoft saying they don't do adult gaming, which is ironic given the fact that they have plentiful of 18 rated games. You have a difficulty in rating systems that try to categorize what sexual content is, but are unable to do so. And so the pornographic games themselves have had to shift to their own generated spaces through platforms such as Netaku that promote and publish different types of pornographic games, especially for queer audiences as well. So I can go on there as a queer player and find a gay game and absolutely play the hell out of it and probably write something else about it too. So even though that they've had to author these spaces for themselves, where mainstream games culture has tried to distance itself from both queerness and also the idea of sexual and queer sexuality as well. We then come to the next theme of sex and possibility, where we kind of see this same repetitive instance of emergent activity through in-game relationships that can shift onto real life, and that could be embodied through queer players themselves, where it hasn't been predicted before. Sexual economies have also taken form, where the game hadn't predicted that they would again occur and still do. So we're seeing a constant cycle of sexual interaction just constantly emerging and creating a possibility for itself to exist. And this obviously trickles down to the kinds of conversations around heterosexual content and queer content as well. These games can also provide possibility and experience into horizons of sexual subcultures and identities, and allow you to embody yourself in a sexual culture that you might not be able to necessarily be access to. So games like Hurt Me Plenty that lets you spank a guy, playing as some kind of ambiguous dominatrix figure, gives the experience of being part of a kink culture, which doesn't actually give an indication as to the identity of the person you play as, which I think adds to this discussion about these games as embodying these queer sensibilities. And then you also have games like Amorous that are a furry dating simulator that allows you to create an identity other than your own and live out as a human or an anthropomorphic furry avatar and live out the fantasies of your dreams, finding a mate of varying preferences. And Amorous as well also provides different kinds of customization to genders, body types, and personality preferences, which is always nice when you're a queer player and you get to see yourself on the screen. And finally, we come to the third theme, which is sex and rearticulation, where the games, in essence, become rearticulated and appropriated, both in terms of the space itself and also the body of the player, to bring about kinds of sexual experiences not necessarily present or make up an absence or two for lack of sexual content. I've put The Sims and Second Life here as both kind of deal with this idea of modded sex, where you're modifying the original rules and system and therefore querying the game through that regard of changing and creating possibilities for yourself to bring about a kind of sexual experience. That could be ranging from taking away the censoring to allowing characters to walk around with genitals where they weren't there before. The list is kind of endless, but there is something quite queer about having the power of how the system works be given to the players rather than the system itself. So I know I've just thrown a hell of a lot out there, and if you come to this point and I've spoken a load of waffle and you don't understand anything, then you're in the same boat as me, because neither do I. The point I am hopefully trying to get at is that these pornographic video games are dealing with various power structures and cultural norms that try to limit or define their meaning, and that becomes associated with the ideas of sex and games themselves. The inclusion of sex in games, whether purposeful or not, creates these forms of emergence and rearticulation and deviance from these normative structures, and thus allude to these queer sensibilities that we may experience within these games. As we all know, there's a lot of conversation about games having certain rules and whether or not that is a hard-hitting or enforced idea. So you could say that games could allow me as a gay male to engage in kinds of queer spaces as a queer person and engage in queer sexuality and sexual identity, whereas I couldn't before. Games as these who still use rule structures, we can take these rules as normative and oppressive systems. But yet, despite that, we still have emergence and transgressive practices. And so we can see how these games can be a queer territory as they're reappropriated for sexuality and create new spaces of normalcy from its distance from the original cultural norms. So we come back to that sex in games is going against the grain. It's going against a industry image, I guess you could say, about what they think is appropriate for a game, about what they think is appropriate for a sexual identity in a game. And I think what this basically underlines is that these games offer new possibilities that queer the sexual space for us, and not only that, but will queer the game space and ultimately offer a sort of queer understanding of how we interact within digital and virtual environments. And where I plan to go is probably to focus deeply on queer identities in this, but that's my thesis, and I'm not talking about that today. That's my whistle stop tour of waffle. I hope that was okay. And if you got the high score, if you guessed Birmingham City, because I totally did not make it obvious at all.